Hey guys, so in this chapter, this is actually going to be broken up into several parts over the next few days, but this is called America's Dirty Little Secret, Adoptees' Outcomes. Now, the next few chapters are sub-chapters of this one, so just making that clear, but everything is uploaded in order, so don't worry. Lori Carangelo starts off with the quote, out of 430 adoptees who killed, 235 killed their adoptive parents and/or adoptive relatives. 76 are known serial killers. And this is from her book, Adopted Killers, 430 Adoptees Who Killed and How and Why They Did It. We will be covering that very shortly. I will probably be doing that in big chunks and probably not throughout because I really want to dive into a lot of these particular individuals. So I will probably do a playlist where it is a mix of both her readings as well as like in-depth characterizations of these individuals. So just be aware of that. That I will have that. I don't know if I can do timestamps. I'm going to try to figure that out for you guys. But if I can do that, that way you guys can check that out. And then if you want to continue on with watching those videos, you can. I know that's not everyone's interest, so I get it. Anyway, we're going to continue on reading America's Dirty Little Secrets, Adoptees' Outcomes chapter. There is no national data to show precisely how many adoptions fail, but what data is available on disrupted and dissolved adoptions, as reported in the Adoption and Donor Conception Fact Book, which is the 2018 edition. It's available on Amazon, also written by Lori Carangelo, is cause for concern. Neither does the federal government track how many children need additional help, and states are not required to track or report such figures, and that is also sourced by experts push for disclosure on failed foster adoptions. And that was a Fox News article in 2011. 50% to 80% of all foreign adoptions were terminated. That is sourced by Saginaw News, Michigan in 1991. A majority of failed adoptions involve older traumatized children said to have reactive attachment disorder, RAD, where children struggle to bond and so they act out against their adoptive families. Children who have been victims of sexual abuse may act out sexually on other siblings in the home. States typically cover a portion of care, but that coverage can run out quickly. The costly services can drain private insurance, leaving parents forced to pay out of pocket or return their adopted child to the state so they can then access government-funded mental health services. Many states have relinquishment policies that force parents to choose between keeping their child or getting them help. And while the experts, this is in quotes, push for disclosure, National Council for Adoption, NCFA, CEO Chuck Johnson pushed for more sealed adoptions, only admitting 5% failure of all domestic adoptions of children older than 3 years of age. And this is in quotes, best interests come into play when a child is truly endangered in the birth environment, something that is seldom a concern in private adoption, but needs to be in this really hard a hard point to understand. And this is Julie Stephen, Harvard Law School, quoted in 2000. In May 2011, several child welfare organizations lobbied Congress for more post-adoption services. Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota, by the way, she is still a senator. She is still trying to get changes made. You will see that soon in terms of what she is pushing for, along with fellow senators and congressmen and women, I should say. Anyway, she introduced a bipartisan bill that would have required states receiving federal subsidies to increase adoptions of foster kids to spend a portion of federal dollars they already receive on adoption services and accurately report failed adoptions. But the bill stalled in committee. Where is the accountability? The chosen child and bad seed myths are share a common feature. They explain adoptees' negative outcomes in terms that they tend to deny adoptees personal autonomy. Both have become part of the cultural vocabulary for defining the experience of being adopted. The concept of someone being born bad has been perpetuated by the adoption industry in an effort to deflect blame away from the adoption and onto alleged bad genes or bad birth parents to explain adoptees' bad behavior. First a novel, and then a Broadway play, and then a movie remade for TV in 1984. The 1956 horror suspense classic The Bad Seed portrays a mother, played by Nancy Kelly, who is slowly coming to the realization that her 8-year-old daughter Rhonda, played by Patty McCormack, is responsible for a string of murders. But it's Rhoda. It's Rhoda. Her name is Rhoda. Rhoda's mother, who is a late discovery adoptee when she learns her own mother was an infamous serial killer. Apparently, the bad seed skipped a generation. Still, the misperception endured. As late as the 1980s, researchers did not consider childhood trauma relevant. Children were believed to have been naturally resilient, such as in The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Perry and I can't say this name. Szlarvitz in 2006. James Wilson, professor of the public policy at Pepperdine University, wrote, "Various scholars have found in studies of twins and of adopted children that some people are at greater risk for habitual offending than others. There is, of course, no crime gene, and we have only a weak sense of what combination of genetic factors facilitates crime." This TV series, Criminal Minds, is a dramatization about FBI profilers who track down serial killers, frequently depicted the unidentified subject, as having been adopted. I remember like maybe one or two of Criminal Minds episodes where they specifically talked about adoption, but now that it makes me think about it, I want to re-go into it and maybe break it down. I don't know. How do you guys feel about that? Let me know down below, because I'm truly interested in going a bunch of different routes, and I want to do what's best for you guys to help with your healing and your resources as well. Anywho, how can this be? Adoptees are chosen children, or so the story goes on. Absent a psychological cause for frontal lobe brain damage, nor physical or sexual abuse is childhood. Adult adoptees with psychopathic behaviors, sociopathic behaviors, are also profiled in terms of suffering intolerable emotional abuse. Adoption is fraught with family secrets and alarming surprises. Adoptees have contradictory self-images, one bad or evil based on the fantasy about unknown parents, and one grandiose as a result of adopters, aka the chosen child story. It is generally known that children who have experienced early childhood separation from one or both parents due to parental divorce, death, or for other reasons, are placed in foster care will have a difficult time for several reasons. One reason is that they lose connectedness with someone like them, in personality and in appearance. They lose role models, they lose security, they also experience a sense of rejection, abandonment, of being unwanted and unloved, and no matter how loving and supportive their substitute caretakers or adopters are, children even believe that they are somehow to blame for the situation, that they are the bad seeds. Adoption, how it is handled in the adoptive family, and how it impacts the adoptee, is rarely addressed at adoptees' criminal trials. After being institutionalized most of their lives, some habitual criminals have decided to turn their lives around because this writer helped them reconnect with their families they never knew, and got answers to who am I, where did I come from, and why was I given up for adoption? So I actually, like I said, I want to dive into some of these particular individuals. Son of Sam being one of them. I don't want to give too much away, but he was adopted at birth and then he snapped at around age 22 after reunion. So that is quite interesting, but there are some things that happened between the ages of 17 to 22 before he snapped and obviously did horrible things. Let me just preface this. While I love true crime stories, it is very sad and can be triggering, and I don't want anyone to feel that way, but I think analyzing how we can do better is super important. Anyway, I'm on a rant right now. Let's continue on. Genetics don't tell the whole story. It only shows inherent personality traits and possibly a predisposition to antisocial behavior. What tips the balance? Why some adoptees turn to crime is what makes their crime unique in their class. They show us how lives touched by adoption are more likely to be ruined by loss as a known history and contact with biological relatives and realities. That's true. Adoptees' outcomes mirrored in politics. On NBC's Dateline in 1998, on Which One Are Yours by Jacqueline Mitchard, Ladies' Home Journal, also published in 1998, the absurdity of the adoption industry's brainwashing was documented in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when Scott Albertret, a federal agent, his adopters Bob and Rosemary Albertret, then Governor Tommy Thompson, who was later HHS Secretary, and Juvenile Court Judge David Conkle decided that an adoptee is a blood relative. Scott Albertret is a single male adoptee who Judge Conkle barred from adopting 2-year-old Abby Mole. Abby's mother, who was Scott Albertret's sister, Susie Mole, also an adoptee, had died of cancer. Her husband, Steve Mole, died in a car accident. At first, the court relying on the fact that the adoptee cannot be a blood relative for priority in adopting under state laws, favored adoption by the baby's godparents, Garth and Mitchell Jorgensen, a married couple who were not related to the child but who had been friends of Abby's deceased parents. In Mitchard's report of the Abby Mole case, adopters from all over wrote letters to the editor and reportedly phoned their legislators, undoubtedly prompted by the National Council for Adoption, NCFA, lobby of adoption agencies who gain media attention by interceding whenever controversy over adoption issues emerges, usually for bad reasons. But let's continue. Scott Albertret wrote the Wisconsin's Children Code changed to read blood relatives including by adoption with full rights and responsibilities. An interesting perversion of rights. Judge Knokel's decision was later reversed. It sounded like an extension as born to legal lie on all adoptees, amended, aka falsified, birth certificates, which names the adopters as the parents at the first time of birth, rather than as the adopters at the first time of adoption. All lies tend to lead to more lies. Incredibly enough, there was no mention in all the talk on Dateline of adoptees' rights, that this adoptee and his deceased sister, as well as the child about to be adopted, do not have the right to know who their true blood relatives really are. They do not know whether the cancer which killed Susie Mole, the child's biological mother, could have been detected earlier and cured had she known there was cancer in her family's medical history, or any other inherent medical problems that could impact their surviving child, Abby Mole. And here is a quote by Gene Patton. Do you have to be a truant, steal cars, get into juvenile detention homes, or drop out of school in order for people to realize that you need to have someone to tell you about your origins? All right. Adoptees' behaviors speak louder than words. In No One Goes Crazy Alone, Paul Wachtel explains that family therapists believe no man is an island, so human miseries must be understood in the terms of how intertwined human destinies are. Our very definition of homelessness, mental illness, and child welfare dictate and constrain the solution we seek. Behaviorism aims to externally control all behavior without taking into account or looking for the root of the behavior. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the field of psychology began to be of interest to many people. Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner were among the first behaviorists. Although behaviorism has been practiced through the centuries, it has been observed that behavior can be controlled through rewards and punishments. Behaviorism is the view that behavior should be explained by observable experiences, not by mental processes. And that's by Santrock in 2008. Behaviorism is a very black and white, as it focuses solely on what is seen and totally ignores what is unseen. For example, behaviorists believe that to get a toddler to stop throwing temper tantrums, negative reinforcement or punishment, such as spanking, must be used to stop the child from having a fit. FYI, spanking is not the answer, okay? Have a stop, have a talk, take the child out of the situation. There's so many other ways without physically harming the child. And yes, I am going to call spanking physical harm. Now, I know that there's a difference between abuse and spanking, but let me be clear. If a child is not old enough to be able to explain their behavior or to explain what they did wrong and why and how they can do better, spanking is not the answer. If they are old enough, then let them do so. And again, spanking is not the answer. All you're doing is teaching the child that physical harm is okay. And that is not the goal that we are set out to do. Okay, sorry. Continuing on. On the other hand, if one wants a toddler to pick up their toys, then according to a behaviorist, positive reinforcement or reward must be administered to the child, such as praise or candy. E.L. Thorndike was one of the early behaviorists, and he summed up this idea into what is known as the law of effect. Behaviorists in general do not take into account children's emotions, ages, development stages, or abilities, or anything else going on within the child or family when it comes to behavior. For the behaviorist, these thoughts, feelings, and motives are not appropriate subject matter for science of behavior because they cannot be directly observed. To ignore the fact of a child's adoptive status when diagnosing and treating their behaviors is to ignore the elephant in the room. None of these parties to an adoption go through it unscathed, especially adoptees. Voluminous studies and case histories in this book support that adoptees are overrepresented in psychotherapy, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, regardless of the age at which they had been surrendered to strangers. David M. Brodzinski, PhD, Professor Emeritus Clinical Psychology, Rutgers University. By the way, I'm going to be reading some of his works as well on this page, so be aware I do have a book coming today. So I haven't decided which book will be next, but he is one that I highly regard, and I did just recently get to speak with him, and he has some good information. So he is not directly related to adoption. He's not part of the triad, but he has recently been realizing that some of his friends and maybe family members were adopted. And that's been more recently, but he's been in the field for at least 30 years. So you can understand that he has quite the experience. Anyway, Research and project director Evan B. Donaldson Adoption Institute conducted one of the nation's largest studies of adopted children at Rutgers, which recognized that adoption itself is a psychological burden to the adoptee, and their problems and symptoms often fall into the adopted child syndrome pattern. Adoptees seem to have trouble trusting others and forming close relationships. Often they feel they don't belong or are unloved and unwanted. With an excessive fear of abandonment, they are constantly testing limits and seeking approval, affection, and acceptance. They experience a severe identity crisis in adolescence around whether they feel they are a full member of the adoptive family or just being loyal to their rescuers. Finding their biological parent or being found by them can stress all parties, no matter the depth or lack of resulting relationship. Where adopters have a shape up or ship out mentality, adolescent adoptees are more likely to act out. Even though professionals agree that adoptees should have access to their origins, politics thwart that good sense. Neither is adoptive status included in prison files. It is not look it does well, I cannot speak. It would not look good for the adoption industry if too many adoptees were criminals, but that is in fact the case. Not because they were bad seeds, but because a closed and inflexible system has caused their behaviors. Each year, incarcerated adoptees' requests for help and finding their kin flood the more than 2,000 private adoptee search groups in the United States and AMFOR's mailbox. And studies have continued to be amassed on the injury due to all parties by the statutory secrecy imposed on all adoptions. One of the most significant is the ongoing butchered studies. Of over 700 pairs of twins separated at birth by adoption, it provides living evidence in the nature versus nurture debate that the genetic pull is greater than environmental influence, and adoptees are overrepresented in the nation's psychiatric and penal facilities. They've been telling us why, but no one has been listening. Many adult adoptees do not realize that their difficulties, at least in part, stem from being adopted. All adoptees have effects of their adoption experience. The degree of the effects is symptomatic behaviors vary a great deal. There are vulnerabilities shared by all adoptees. And this is sourced by Jeannie de Snodgrass. I know that's quite a last name. She is an adoptee, and she wrote Appendices to Statistics on Effects of Adoption, a paper for credit at the Georgetown University. In those most vulnerable, a distinct pattern of behavior can be seen. Some labeled this the adopted child syndrome, and here are the facts to this. 60 to 85% of teens at the Coldwater Canyons Center for Personal Development, a former acute care psychiatric hospital school in California, were adopted. 30 to 40 times the norm, and this is quoted by Dr. Lee Bloom, former unit director at the Coldwater Canyon Hospital. 25 to 35% of the young people in residential treatment centers are adoptees, and this is 17 times the norm. And this is written by Betty Jean Lifton, Birco, Panor and Lawrence. And then, hold on. Adopted children are disproportionately represented with learning disabilities and organic brain syndrome. This is by Schechter from Genetic Behaviors. Adoptees are more likely to have difficulties with drug and alcohol abuse, as well as eating disorders, attention deficit disorder, infertility, untimely pregnancies, and suicide. And this is from Young, Bowman, Mitchell, Ostroff, Ansfield, Lifton, Schechter. I know that's quite a handful, but those are all the names that contributed. And then adoptees are more likely to choose alternate lifestyles by Ansfield, Lifton. And alarming high numbers of adoptees are sent to disciplinary schools or locked out of their adoptive homes, and that is by Anderson and Carlson. Adoption is a psychological burden to the adoptee relative to the separation of the child from the mother. And it's not just adoptees who fail to escape emotional scarring from the biological family. Separation and adoption, according to psychotherapists Annette Baron, Ruben Pinar, and Arthur D. Sororsky, who identify parent and adopter grief from their respective losses. And this is written in The Adoption Triangle: The Effects of Sealed Records on Adoptees, Birth Parents, and Adoptive Parents. One of the books I will be reading soon in the next coming months. Kaesler Permanent Healthcare conducted a study in 1979 of mothers who surrender babies. 40% reported depression, which was then considered the most common emotional disorder, whereas major depression is now considered a mental illness, and 60% reported medical, sexual, and physical problems. And for adopters, adoption is often marketed as a treatment or cure for infertility, leaving adopters with unfulfilled expectations and unresolved griefs from loss of the children they couldn't have. Because adoptees in whose best interest their parents were persuaded to relinquish them, in whose best interest they were given to strangers who assumed permanent custody through adoption. The primary focus needs to be acknowledging the injury to the adoptee with the goal of prevention. In the 1990s, David Kirschner, PhD, is quoted in the press as citing the HMO's tendency for limiting treatment of very young adoptees misdiagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Dexedrine Xylert, and the most widely prescribed Ritalin and Melaril are routinely administered to youngsters who are acting out in response to their inability to attach to their adopters. They miss their families and are feeling the connectedness. Drugs cannot cure such pain. Why would HMOs approved central nervous system stimulants, CNS, over psychotherapy, drugs that are believed to have played a role in the adoptee of Jeremy Strohmeyer's rape murder of a 7-year-old Charisse inversion in a Nevada casino restroom? According to Kirschner, the for-profit managed care cooperations are opting for the less expensive drug therapy over psychotherapy. The drug industry is certainly not complaining and has also rebutted claims that drugs prescribed to children for disorders such as hyperactivity or depression are likely to cause fatal heart attacks, as in 7 unexplained deaths recorded in the late 1990s in children taking such drugs. In 1998, Bennett Leventhal, a child psychologist at the University of Chicago, estimated that 6 to 10 of all children with ADHD, but only 2 of the 6 were being treated for it. He further claimed that fears about overuse of drugs like Ritalin are unfounded. And this is quoted in Arabia Living in 1998. The number of prescriptions for stimulants such as Ritalin and dexedrine to treat ADHD, particularly in young children, has increased dramatically during the last 10 years. Over and under identification is a problem. There is no way to make an adequate medical or psychological assessment in a 7-minute visit. So what we have is a situation where teachers complain and physicians write a prescription. It takes time and effort that most physicians don't have and most insurers won't pay for. And that is quoted by David Kessler, MD, Director of the Developmental and Behavior Pediatrics at St. Joseph's Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona, in the American Medical News in 2000. Novartis, the company that manufactures Ritalin, the American Psychiatric Institute, and a patient advocacy group called CHADD, CHADD, children and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder were used by several hundred patients, charging that these groups conspired to promote diagnosis of ADHD to boost drug sales. In Adopted Killers, some of the adoptees had taken street drugs prior to their crime. DEA has classified Ritalin in the same category as morphine, opium, and cocaine. Littleton, Colorado, was the most notorious for doling out Ritalin to kids, particularly in wealthy suburbs, as well as in public-supported foster care. The long-term effects are still being debated in the wake of the Columbine high school shootings in Littleton. Adoptees in the following chapters who become addicted to street drugs and those who killed were prescribed Ritalin, Malaril, and other mood-altering drugs which led to their addictions and helped trigger violence against themselves and others. Substance abuse is said to be common among adoptees. The use of alcohol, LSD, methadone, marijuana, and other drugs is often another means of showing displacement or anger at society, parents, and most of all, self-anger. And this is in The Adopted Child, Joseph G. Ainsfield, MD. Many drug-addicted adoptees have reported being sexually abused by an adoptive family member. In 2 5-year studies by Carl Anderson, Ph.D., the colleagues at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, the researchers found that repeated sexual abuse affects blood flow and function of a key brain region related to substance abuse. The cerebellar varus, which coordinates emotional behavior, and dopamine, a neurotransmitter, involved in addiction. The 2 studies analyzed 32 subjects ages 18 to 22 and 537 college students who frequently abused drugs. Physical and emotional abuse are similarly linked to addiction. It is not difficult to understand why an adopted person would seek out the mind-altering and other psychological effects from drugs. Drugs have also been blamed in the deaths of adopted children of Hollywood stars James Bronson and Carol O'Connor, as well as others, but media fails to consider whether they were troubled by their adoptive status as the root cause. Not all traumatized children become suicidal or violent, and there are no simple answers to explain why some adoptees kill. But often the side effects of prescribed drugs are overlooked. In his book, Reclaiming Our Children, A Healing Solution for a Nation in Crisis, by Perseus in 2000, Peter R. Bergen, M.D., a private practitioner in Bethesda, Maryland, presents strong evidence that psychiatric drugs commonly cause psychosis and aggression in children, and that they probably contributed to the individual case of school violence. In his best-selling Talking Back to Prozac and Talking Back to Ritalin, he makes specific recommendations for improving family and school life based on the sound psychological and ethical principles. But what if the family is a shadow family? A prohibition to the child under the unsound psychology and unethical practice perpetuate by closed adoption. What if the child does not accept his adopters as family? No drug treatment or attachment therapy can change that. Only compound the problem. Attachment and rebirthing therapies are out. Oh man, this one's going to be tough to read. So hold on. Bear this in mind. This is going to probably trigger you if you're not already triggered. So just a warning. While behaviors were ignoring the root cause of certain behaviors of adopted children who they were treating with attachment therapy, the American Psychological Association, through its section of child maltreatment and its division on child, youth, and family services, DCYFS, endorsed a 14-page report from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, which condemned attachment therapy is practiced widely in the U.S. It is not only urged substantial changes in the attachment-based diagnosis, assessment, treatment, and parenting approach, which purport to help children described as attachment disorder, with recommendations that reflect criticism of the overuse of reactive attachment disorder, RAD, diagnosis by providers, and the failure to rule out other more commonly encountered conditions. But it is also called upon child welfare professionals not to tolerate parenting behaviors that pretend to be therapeutic but are actually abusive. Examples cited include withholding food, water, or toilet access as punishment, exerting exaggerated levels of control over a child, restraining children as treatment. This is really why it became banned, by the way. I think over 14 kids had died because of this particular restraining. And intentionally provoking out of control emotional distress, that too. Deaths from rebirthing therapy eventually resulted in its discontinuance. The suspects included therapists and centers such as Foster Clinic, Arthur Becker Weidman, Nancy Thomas, Daniel Hughes, Gregory Keck, Keith Reber, Deborah Hogg, Ronald Federici, the Cascade Center, and Colorado's Institute for Attachment and Child Development, IACD, previously called Attachment Center at Evergreen, or ACE. And this is according to the AT News in 2006 archived issues of Advocates for Children and Therapy, which opposes abusive and unvalidated psychotherapy, in the Task Force Child Maltreatment Journal in 2006. The adopted child syndrome, in, then out, now in, a dissociative disorder and its underlying adopted child syndrome, studied by David Kirschnick, PhD, in 1978, reveal the complexities of adoptees' dual identities and secret pasts. While Dr. Barry Brazelton refers to ACS as malarkey in the press, and the psychiatric community would not accept the adopted child syndrome theory, the syndrome was successfully used as a defense in the 1988 case of Patrick Degolek, who was 14, tried as an adult for the murder. Kirschnick identified the syndrome as contributing to Patrick's psychiatric rage when he killed his adopters and set fire to their home. The New York Times account of the crime explained that Degolek's shocking act was to him the only way to remove what he perceived to be the barrier preventing him from finding his natural parents, his adopters. Kirschner was careful to quantify adopted children, stating it does not apply to the vast majority of adopted children who turn out as normal as anyone else, and he naively guesstimated that only 10 to 15% of adoptees display problems. Kirschner later wrote, "I believe that most adoptees have the same emotional vulnerabilities that are seen in dramatic form from the adopted child syndrome, and that all adoptees are at risk." Later, he is careful to qualify that by claiming only a subset of a spectrum of adoptees have adopted child syndrome behaviors, but he does not define the spectrum in which the subset occurs. This writer believes it means the entire spectrum of adoptees, with the extremes of acquisitions at one end of the spectrum and of rebellion at the other end of the spectrum, in response to adoption's unreasonable impositions. Psychiatrist David Cook said adopted child syndrome is simply a new name for a phenomenon which has been observed since the 1950s. Indeed, in 1953, a young social worker, Jean Patton, herself an adoptee, published her studies, the first studies linking adoptee behaviors with their adoptions. In 1992, attorney Donald Humphrey, himself an adoptee, called attention to the syndrome as a factor in cases where children murdered their adopters. In his talk, Violence in Adoption, in 1992 at the conference of the American Adoption Congress. John Hemming, member of the British Parliament referred to AMFOR's webpage on the adopted child syndrome in its history and relevance today to make the point that it's the child who is most damaged by the corrupt child system in the UK as well. Studies by pediatric physician and child psychiatrist T. Barry Brazelton revealed that 72 hours after birth, a baby can hear and vaguely see and form attachment behaviors learned in the womb from the mother's natural body rhythms. And in fathers can recognize newborns by touch, an LA Times article written in 1993. It was reported 61% of blindfolded fathers recognize their newborns just by stroking the backs of their hands, and the mothers had similar results stroking their baby's cheeks. David Kirshner's adopted child syndrome identifies 8 behaviors common to varying degrees in adoptees he studies, and it goes as follows. Conflict with authority, for example, truancy, preoccupation with excessive fantasy, pathological lying, stealing, running away, learning difficulties, underachievement, overachievement, lack of impulsive control, including sexual acting out, ranging from promiscuity to prosecutable sexual offenses, and fire setting or fascination with fire. As an example of how pro-adoption politics can pressure a well-respected authority to use politically correct adoption language can be found in the message to Kirshner that was posted to the news group Alt Adoption on November 27th, 2000 by Steve White, a self-described adopter and doctor, wow, that rhymes, at University of Chicago Medical Department. As someone else noted, you might consider a different name for your findings. In the present name, Adopted Child Syndrome, or ACS, permits some to misrepresent your work with relative cases. Kirshner devoted a good portion of his career to analyzing adoptees. His adopted child syndrome, ACS theory, that he advanced in the last 22 years even found acceptance in court as a legal defense, and that saved adoptee Patrick DeGiulach from the death penalty. When the pro-adoption group, headed by an alleged Dr. White, objected to Kirshner's advancing the idea of the adopted child syndrome as stigmatizing adoptees, Kirshner responded to White, "Thank you, and I have been considering a different terminology." And so adopted child syndrome seemed at least temporarily out. 7 years after the movement of political waffling on a new name for ACS and AMFOR's controversial website, the 5 years after the 2002 edition of The Chosen Children on September 17, 2017, Kirshner's The Connected Between the Adoption and Murder was published. The adopted child syndrome was again in. As the aging proponents of the adopted child syndrome defense retire from public discourse, a new generation of advocates and reformers is emerging. So she then goes on to quote, "On the day came when the risk to remain closed in a bud became the more painful than the risk it took to blossom." That's by Anais Nin. And now we are covering choosing a therapist according to evidence-based practice. It is so important as adoptees to find a good therapist, especially one that is trauma-informed. You can look for one in your area. Psych Today is a good resource to start. They do take different insurances, so be clear about that, but there is a special certification that the therapist needs in order to become adoption trauma informed. Now, if you feel comfortable with a different type of therapist, that is okay, but just understand that some will not be well versed in the adoptee realm. So I want to make that very clear. Okay. As of 2019, and for several years prior, Tracy I. Carlis, PhD, a forensic psychologist specializing in adoption, herself an adoptee, has been serving as an expert evaluating adoptees who killed, saving them from the death penalty, which included Moses Kamen of California, Zachary Pine of Colorado, Ryan Champion of Kentucky, Jamie Piero Cole of Texas, and Brandon Christopher Menard of California. The adopted child had been the most psychoanalyzed child from 1941 forward. Adoptees and therapists who abused and killed adopted children while attempting to fix them, as in the case of David Polaris, Nathaniel Carver, and Candace Newmaker, all demonize and blame these children for their own deaths. According to Advocates for Children in Therapy on childrenintherapy.org, when a troubled child does need counseling and treatment, the therapist would best be on the staff of a university or hospital-sponsored clinic rather than a private practice, and be able to describe what reflective supervision the child would receive. The therapist should be a family therapist, or if the therapist is treating the child alone, they should guide the parents to get supportive counseling. And of course, the therapist should be licensed or have no history of professional disciplinary action. But if the child is adopted, also inquire that the therapist's experience and learnings with regard to the unique experience and problems of adopted children. For these children, the therapist should have a clear concept of the adoptive status as being abnormal, not the child. Joel Soul, who is LCSW and DAPA, meaning he is a social worker. He is also, I believe, an adoptee. But he has a YouTube channel as well. We're going to be analyzing some of his videos as well as some of his books and his website, because he is a great source for working through issues. We're going to continue anyway. A Bessie Bernard Black Market adoptee, yes, he was also adopted, is such a therapist with 30 years experience specializing in adoption-related issues. He formed a group called Adoption Healing. Instead of therapies that attempt to reprogram the adopted child, Nancy Newton Verrier, which we read The Primal Wound from her. I have another book also coming from her. Anyway, advises adopters to understand the difficulty in growing up without seeing oneself reflected anywhere, telling the child about adoption before they know what it means, answering questions honestly, and don't speak for anyone else. So that's towards the mother. Never say you should feel grateful. Please don't ever say that. That's disgusting. Adopters should feel grateful. The child would never choose this. Exactly. Learn to understand child's anger as a cover for pain. Empathize with the pain. Never threaten abandonment, no matter how provocative the child becomes. Allow the child to be themselves rather than imposing your expectations. Alright, anyway, that is the end of this chapter, this part of this chapter. We are going to continue on tomorrow with more. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you guys tomorrow.